"Sir, this isn't the kind of place you can just walk into." The man didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for a wallet or a card or anything that might explain who he was. He just looked at the clerk. "I'd like a room," he said. "That's all. We don't accommodate walk-ins at this hour." 3 minutes later, that same clerk handed 2 key cards to a couple who hadn't made a reservation. Smiled like he meant it. Security was called. A little girl woke up and asked one question. One question that made every adult in that lobby go completely silent. And the man who owned every inch of that building hadn't said a word yet. He built it from nothing. 11 years. 9 properties. Every tile, every light fixture, every decision about what a place should feel like when you walk through the door. All of it made because he believed something simple and refused to stop believing it. That the way a place treated people told you everything about the people running it. On a Friday night in October, the man who owned all of it was told he couldn't have a room. This is that story. The flight from Seattle landed 94 minutes late. Not weather, not mechanical failure. A gate change that became a ground delay that became everyone sitting on a plane at the terminal for 40 minutes while the crew waited on clearance that should have come before boarding. The kind of delay that didn't have a villain. Just a cascade of small failures that added up to something that cost everyone an hour and a half they hadn't budgeted. Calvin Reeves spent those 40 minutes doing 2 things: answering emails that could have waited until Monday, and watching his daughter sleep. Her name was Dara, 8 years old. She'd claimed 2 seats with the complete physical commitment of a child who had decided this was her sleeping arrangement now, and the airline's original seating configuration was simply incorrect. A stuffed bear named Scout was tucked to her cheek, one worn ear pressed against her cheek. Scout had been washed enough times that its original color existed now only in theory. What it was now was the color of something that had been loved for a long time without apology. Calvin had been gone for 23 days, Seattle for 11, Chicago for 7, Dallas for 5, which was supposed to be 2. It became 5 because a contract negotiation hit a structural problem on day 2, and the problem turned out to be load-bearing and couldn't be worked around without someone staying in the room until it moved. Calvin stayed. The problem moved on day 4. He spent day 5 on the cleanup, the part nobody saw, but that mattered as much as anything that came before it. His daughter stayed with his sister in Decatur. She was fine. She was always fine. That was part of what he carried on that drive-in from the airport, the knowledge that his kid had gotten good at being okay without him, that her adaptability was partly a skill she'd developed because she'd needed to, that the necessity of that skill was something he'd created. He didn't let himself stay with it too long. That particular guilt was a swamp. You could sink into it, or you could acknowledge it and keep moving, and only one of those options helped anyone. Least of all Dara. One hand on the wheel, the other on his knee. Dara in the back seat, Scout still as deep as in position, Atlanta unspooling past the windows into the way it did at midnight on a Friday, sparse and lit and moving at its own unhurried pace. He could go home. The house was 40 minutes from here. His housekeeper had restocked the refrigerator that morning, the same way she always did before he came back from a long trip, because she'd been doing this for 6 years and knew his schedule better than he did. The bed would be exactly as he'd left it 3 weeks ago. The house would be quiet with a particular way, a place that'd been empty and was waiting for someone to return and make it a home again. He could do that. Drive the 40 minutes, get Dara settled without fully waking her, sleep in his own bed for the first time in more than 3 weeks. He took the 5th Avenue exit, that without fully deciding to. That was how it worked with him on these nights. Not at decisions exactly. More like the car knowing something he hadn't finished articulating yet. The exit came, and his hands turned the wheel, and by the time he'd thought it through, he was already committed to the direction. The Alderton was 11 blocks from that exit. He'd opened it 4 years ago. The ribbon cutting on a Saturday morning in April, his whole core team there. The lobby full of people who'd worked 18 months. to bring the building from a gutted shell to the day when guests would finally walk through the doors. He'd stood on the marble floor with a pair of scissors that were too large for the ribbon and said what he believed about the place, that it was going to treat every single person who walked through its doors like they were expected. Not like they needed to earn it. Not like belonging was a question that was still open. Like it had already been decided before they arrived that they mattered. He hadn't been back in 6 weeks. Which meant it was time. Calvin Reeves had maintained a practice since the first property he ever opened. The mid-range hotel in Charlotte that was now the oldest address in the Reeves Hospitality Group portfolio. Before any formal scheduled visit, he went once unannounced. Dressed the way he was dressed now. No advance call to the property manager. No heads up to being in the build. Nothing would change the temperature of the place before he got there. He wore the same clothes on every one of these visits. Dark jean, plain sneakers with a small scuff on the left toe that he kept meaning to address and never did. A gray hoodie that had been washed enough times to go soft in a way that new hoodies never were. No watch. No luggage that announced anything about who he was before he opened his mouth. Because the truth of a place only showed itself when no one was running a performance for the boss. His father had given him that, not in words. Earl Reeves had never been the kind of man who sat his son down to deliver organized lessons. He'd just lived in a particular way, and Calvin had paid close enough attention for long enough to understand what it meant. Earl had worked the night security shift at the Hargrove Hotel in Charlotte for 22 years. Not because it was what he'd planned. Not because it was what he'd wanted when he graduated with a degree in architectural engineering from a state school in Virginia. The first in his family to finish college, a young man who could hold 3-dimensional space in his head and had rotated at will, who could look at a blueprint and see not just what was drawn, but what it would feel like to stand inside the finished structure, to move through the rooms, to understand how the light would fall at different hours. He'd applied for 14 positions in the 3 years after graduation. Architectural firms in Charlotte, in Raleigh, in Atlanta. City planning offices. A bank that needed someone to assess structural proposals for commercial loan applications. 2 construction companies that did the kind of work Earl had trained to do. An architectural consultancy that brought him back for 3 separate rounds of interviews with 3 separate people, each interview better than the last, each ending with the same phrase delivered with the same confident warmth. We'll be in touch. They were never in touch. The 14th rejection came on a Thursday in November, and on the following, Earl Reeves accepted the Hargrove position because it was what was offered, and it paid, and he had a family coming, and the theoretical job was not coming, and the actual job was there. Once he accepted it, he committed to it the way he committed to everything. Fully, without complaint, with the complete investment of this who a man how you did a thing was inseparable from who you were. 22 years. He was excellent at every part of it. He knew the Hargrove building the way architects knew the buildings they designed. Intimately, structurally, with an understanding of not just what it was, but how it worked and why. He knew every system, every pattern, which hallways got drafty in winter, and which exits needed the hinges oiled, and which guests were going to need help that they hadn't asked for yet. He knew the night life of the building in a way that the daytime management never did, because the building at night was a different place, quieter and more honest, and Earl had spent 22 years learning its language. The guests didn't see him. Management thought about him only when something needed doing. He was infrastructure, as necessary and as invisible as the pipes in the walls. Calvin was 11 years old the first time he really understood this. His mother had driven to the Hargrove on a Saturday afternoon to bring Earl his lunch, which he'd left on the counter that morning. Calvin came along because it was Saturday, and there was nothing else happening. And he liked the drive, and he liked seeing where his father worked, which in his 11-year-old understanding was a place of some importance and authority. He stood in the lobby of that hotel in his good shoes, because his mother had told him to wear his good shoes, and he watched his father in uniform walk past a group of guests who were gathered near the entrance waiting for a cab. None of them looked at Earl, not with hostility, not with any awareness at all. The way you didn't look at the furniture, the way you didn't notice the overhead lights until one of them burned out and the absence was suddenly the only thing in the room. Earl spotted Calvin over their heads. He gave a small nod, private, contained, a nod that said, "I see you. I know you're here. Everything is fine." Calvin nodded back. He carried that lobby with him for 30 years, not consciously, not as something he returned to deliberately. More the way you carried a landscape you'd grown up in. It was just part of how you understood face space and distance and what a place could do to a person. He bought the Hargrove building 12 years ago. It was the first acquisition of Reeves' Hospitality Group, back when the group was Calvin and one other person, and a spreadsheet that made the numbers work if you agreed not to scrutinize the assumptions too closely. He bought it, gutted it down to the walls, and rebuilt it as a mid-range property with a philosophy baked into every training document, every hiring decision, every physical detail of how the space was arranged, and how the light fell. Treat every person who walks in like they were expected. He didn't tell his father about the purchase until after the deal closed. He'd wanted to be certain before he said it out loud. He'd wanted the thing to be real before he made it into a story. Earl had gone quiet on the phone. Not surprised quiet. The quiet of a man sitting with something he didn't have immediate language for. Calvin had heard that particular quiet his whole life and had learned to wait through it rather than fill it. Then Earl had said, "Did you change the carpet in the lobby?" Calvin had laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere that hadn't been reached in a while. Ripped the whole thing out. "Good," Earl said. It was terrible carpet. Earl Reeves died 18 months later. Heart attack, early on a Thursday morning in July, 61 years old. He'd been working part-time at a hotel property across town because complete stiltness had never agreed with him and he'd never made peace with not being useful. His heart gave out doing the thing he'd spent his adult life doing, which was showing up. Calvin gave the eulogy in a church in Charlotte, with 300 people in the pews and the heat of midsummer pressing through the high windows. He said many true things. About his father's patience, about his humor, which was dry and precise and always arrived when you weren't quite expecting it. About the way Earl could explain complicated things in simple terms, and could listen to anything completely, giving his full attention in the way that had become rare enough to feel like a gift. He didn't say the part about the lobby. Some things you didn't explain to people who already carried them. And the people who needed the explanation weren't going to reach it from the outside. The Alderton came through the windshield the way it always did at night, warm from the inside. The light pressing through the glass, in specific of a goal of a build that had made real decisions about how it wanted to feel. Clean lines, the covered entry, the quiet authority of something that didn't need to announce itself to be understood. Calvin pulled in under the portico. The valet was a young man, early 20s, who drive with the professional ease of someone who had done this enough times to make it look simple. Calvin handed over the keys without ceremony. He was already looking at the building, taking its temperature, noting the condition of the enchantry and the planters and the way the front glass was maintained. Clean, cared for. The small details in order. He unbuckled Dara from her seat. She stirred, made a sound that was somewhere between language and not. Then she found his shoulder the way she always found it. With the practiced ease of a child who had been carried many times and trusted without question that she wouldn't be dropped. Calvin took Scout in his other hand, walked to the revolving door and pushed through. The lobby came in all at once. That was the thing about a well-designed entrance. You didn't experience it in pieces. You didn't arrive at it incrementally. The warmth, the low pulse of jazz from the bar area, the faint scent that wasn't perfume but wasn't nothing. The sight had Italian marble underfoot and the mahogany at the front desk and the arrangement of furniture that made the space feel generous without feeling empty. All of it rustled up simultaneously, the way a piece of music arrived. Calvin had approved every element of this room, the tile pattern chosen after 3 rounds of samples, because the first 2 were close, but close wasn't right. The lighting temperature, which he'd argued about with the consultant for the better part of an afternoon, because there was a real and meaningful difference between a light that made people feel at ease and light that was merely dim. And he had refused to treat those as the same thing. The music he'd specified down to the playlist rotation and the volume, because a hotel lobby at this hour needed jazz that settled into the room rather than sitting on top of it, that you felt before you consciously heard it. He stood just inside the entrance. Not long enough to let the room come to him before he moved through it. Enough to feel, as accurately as he could, what a person felt when they arrived here after a long day, a long flight, a child on their shoulder, and a week accumulated hired done in the bonuses. The room felt like a rival. That was what he'd built it to feel like. He crossed to the front desk. The clerk on duty was young, middle 20s, clean-cut in the way of someone who took his appearance seriously. The Alderton's navy uniform pressed with careful attention. His name tag said Brett. He looked up when Calvin approached with the automatic trained acknowledgement of someone whose job required him to register arrivals. Something changed in his face. It was small. It wasn't the kind of thing a person standing 12 feet away would have registered. But Calvin was 2 feet away, and he'd spent a career developing the ability to read what happened in rooms before anyone said a word, and what he saw was this. Brett's eyes moved once, down and back up. A sweep that lasted less than a second. The hoodie, the jeans, the sleeping child, the absence of luggage that announced anything. A beat. Then another. Brett's eyes had returned to his screen. "Good evening," Calvin said. One night. 2 guests. Standard room is fine. I don't need anything special." Brett stayed with the screen a beat longer than the question required. Then he looked up and leaned forward slightly, pitching his voice to carry perhaps 10 feet in either direction without being fully private. "Sir, I'm sorry. We don't accommodate walk-ins at this hour." Calvin looked at him steadily. "Is that an all-hours policy or specific to after 11? "After 11, sir. Reservation only. I've stayed at Alderton properties on multiple occasions, and I've never encountered that policy before. I apologize for any confusion, sir." Calvin said nothing for a moment. He turned his head slightly and looked at the 2 guests sitting in the lounge chairs along the east wall. Man in a blazer, woman in a coat that had cost serious money. Carry-on bags at their feet. The particular alertness of people who had finished traveling but hadn't yet finished arriving. "When did that policy go into effect?" Calvin asked. Brett blinked once. "It's our standard protocol, sir." "Understood." He stepped back from the desk and waited. He didn't move to a chair immediately. He stood where he was, Dara on his shoulder, Scout in his other hand, and he watched the front desk with the patient needed to face attention of someone who needed to understand something before they could act on it. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, the couple from the lounge chairs stood and approached the desk. Brett's entire posture changed before they reached him. Not subtly. The shift was visible from where Calvin stood. His shoulders came up. His chin lifted slightly. A smile arrived that was real enough to be convincing, warm enough to fill the counter between them. The whole register of his body opened into something available and welcoming. "Welcome to the Alderton. Do you have a reservation with us this evening?" They did not. Walk-ins, exactly as Calvin was. Within 4 minutes, Brett had confirmed a room, processed a card, and handed over 2 key cards with a warmth that made the interaction feel like hospitality rather than transaction. Calvin watched every second of it. He watched the timing. He watched the warmth that had not been available 4 minutes earlier. And he watched one other thing, the detail that told him more than anything else, because it answered the question that had been forming in him since he first walked up to the desk. In the half-second, before Brett turned to greet the arriving couple, his eyes moved upward to the camera above the desk. A small glance. Habitual. The kind of thing a person did without thinking because it had become automatic, the ways you checked a mirror when you walked past one. Calvin had specified the placement of that camera himself. He knew exactly where it pointed and what it captured. And standing here now with his daughter, in the lobby of his own hotel, he understood with complete clarity what it meant that a young man at his front desk had developed the reflex of checking that camera before making a decision about how to respond to a walk-in guest. That glance wasn't instinct. Instinct didn't look at cameras. Trained behavior looked at cameras. Someone had conchit something under Brett for, not explicitly, not in writing, not in any way that could be put in a document or shown to anyone, but clearly enough and consistently enough that Brett had absorbed it as reflex. The rule lived in the glance, in the posture shift, in the specific warmth that was available for some guests before they said a word and not available for others. That hadn't come from Brett. Brett was 27 years old and new enough to the hotel to still be learning the shape of the job. He hadn't constructed this. He'd inherited it. The way people inherited the cultures of the places they entered, absorbing the unwritten rules, because the unwritten rules were the only ones anyone actually enforced. Calvin walked back to the desk. "I'd like to speak with your manager on duty, please." Brett's hand moved to the desk phone. The movement was slightly more deliberate than the action required. The call lasted 45 seconds. When he replaced the receiver, he didn't look directly at Calvin. "Someone will be right with you, sir." Calvin waited. He looked at the concierge station while he waited. A woman in her early 30s was organizing papers a surface of the desk with the focused attention of someone who was working very hard at the task of appearing to work. Her name tag said Della. She hadn't looked directly at Calvin since he'd come in, but she'd been tracking the situation at the front desk with the peripheral attention of someone who didn't fully look and couldn't fully look away. Her hands had stopped moving twice in the last several minutes. Not for long. A second, maybe less. And then she'd resume slightly too deliberately, the way you resumed doing something when you were covering the fact that your nod stopped. She knew something was wrong. She was sitting with that knowledge and not knowing what to do with it from where she was standing, which was its own particular kind of difficult. Gary Sutton arrived in under 2 minutes. Late 40s. Solidly built, the kind of man who'd once been more athletic and had let it consolidate into something denser. The Alderton's navy uniform in the manager's variant. Same base color, different cut. A detail at the collar that marked his position in the building's hierarchy. His name tag gave only his first name. That was its own kind of statement about how he understood authority. First names were approachable. Last names were accountable. He crossed the lobby with a measured dad who had been briefed on the type of situation he was walking into and had already formed his conclusion about how it ended. He positioned himself beside Brett, behind the desk. The geometry was deliberate. 2 of them on one side, Calvin and his sleeping daughter on the other. "Sir." His voice was professionally calibrated, the careful register of someone managing a situation toward an outcome. "I understand there may have been some confusion about our availability tonight." "No confusion," Calvin said. "Your clerk told me there were no rooms available." 3 minutes later, he checked in a walk-in couple with no reservation. "I watched the whole thing from here. Our staff exercises professional judgments, assessing the needs of our guests. I stand behind those decisions. Not a question, not agreement. Just the words held up to the light. That's correct." Calvin looked at him. What he saw was a man who had walked to this desk with his conclusion already formed and his defense already arranged. Gary Sutton had not come out here to understand what had happened. He hadn't come to ask Brett a question or look at the check-in record or hear Calvin's account before responding to it. He'd come to end the situation on his own terms, to use the weight of his position the way you used a door. Shut firmly, locked if necessary, and entirely certain about which side of it you were supposed to remain on. Calvin recognized this. He'd been on the receiving end of this specific look of certainty enough times in his life that he knew its shape the way you knew the shape of a piece of furniture you'd been bumping into in the dark for years. He'd felt it at 23, when he walked into a bank in Charlotte to apply for a small business loan, and the loan officer had made a decision before Calvin opened the folder. At 31, trying to get a meeting with a hotel group that wouldn't return his calls until his second property opened, and suddenly they were very interested in talking. At 37, walking into a room of investors who had already sorted him into a category and were waiting to see whether he'd stay in it. He'd outlasted every one of those walls, but he was standing in the lobby of his own building. And his daughter was going to remember this night. And what she remembered would be shaped by what she watched her father do next. "I'd like your full name and your exact title," Calvin said. "For the record." Gary provided them without warmth. Calvin committed them to memory. Then he stepped back from the desk, crossed to the chair along the east wall, and sat down. He took Dara's weight carefully, positioning her so her head stayed on his shoulder without jarring her. Scout went on his knee. He sat, and he watched. The lobby continued its Friday night business around him. The couple who just checked in had gone upstairs. The remaining guests in the lounge maintained the careful disinterest of people who were aware of something happening nearby and had decided, each for their own reasons, that it was not their situation. At the concierge desk, Della had stopped pretending to organize papers. Her hands were flat on the surface. She was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who was listening for something and didn't know yet what to do with what they were hearing. Gary had not gone back to the back offices. He'd positioned himself near the front desk with his arms folded across his chest, and the patient watchfulness of a man waiting for a problem to understand that it was as a problem and remove itself accordingly. Every 90 seconds or so, his eyes moved across the lobby to where Calvin sat. Every time they carried the same message: "You're still here. I would prefer that you weren't." Calvin watched this without responding to it. He was thinking about his father. Not the eulogy version of Earl Reeves. Not the church in Charlotte with the 300 people and the midsummer heat. The kitchen table version. 3 in the morning after a double shift, Earl coming through the back door, still in his coat, sitting at the table without speaking. Calvin across from him, not feeling the silence because he'd understood from the time he was 9 or 10 that the silence wasn't emptiness. It was his father working through something, moving the accumulated weight of the night into some arrangement where it could be put down so he could come back to self and press for his family. And then, without fail, Earl would ask about Calvin's day, every time. In whatever condition the night had left him in, however much the shift had taken, he would come back from wherever he went in those quiet minutes and ask his son about his day with genuine curiosity, as if Calvin's ordinary Thursday at school was the most interesting thing that had happened anywhere. That was the thing Calvin had carried longest, not the injustice of the Hargrove, not the architectural degree that had led to 22 years of someone else's building. The fact that Earl Reeves had absorbed all of it, and had still come home and meant his questions, had still been curious about his kid's ordinary day, had not let the smallness the world had handed him make him smaller inside his own house. That sustained refusal. That was what Calvin had spent his adult life trying to build something worthy of. Gary crossed the lobby, the deliberate walk of a man performing authority, measuring his steps, so they conveyed the right combination of control and inevitability. He stopped near Calvin's chair and lowered his voice to the register of something meant to sound private while still being audible to anyone within 15 feet. "Sir, I want to be straightforward with you. This is a private establishment. You've been informed that we're unable to accommodate you this evening. Continuing to occupy the lobby after receiving that information is not something we're going to allow." Calvin looked up at him. "I'm sitting in a chair. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't caused any disruption to any other guest in this building. I haven't done anything that would provide you legal grounds to remove me. I'm not asking. The room changed. Not loudly. In the way that rooms changed, when something moved from implied to stated, from a question to a fact. The man with the drink at the bar set it down without picking it back up. Della's head came up a fraction. Two guests near the elevator, who had been talking in low voices, stopped talking. Calvin looked at Gary's face. At the certainty there, the undisturbed, unexamined confidence of a man who had walked into this situation knowing exactly how it ended and had once considered that he might have gotten the situation wrong. Then call security, Calvin said. I want this on record. Gary's jaw moved. He turned toward the far end of the lobby and gave a short, precise nod. Two security guards came forward from their position near the far wall. They moved without hurrying, taking up the space on either side of Calvin's chair with the ease of people who had performed this particular maneuver before. Professional, unhurried, certain, and that was when Dara woke up, not gradually, all at once. One moment completely asleep, the next completely present, eyes open and clear in the lobby light, taking in everything, the space, the guards, the carefully held quality of her father's stillness, in a single continuous sweep. She sat up straighter. Both arms went around Scout. She looked at the lobby the way she looked at everything she was trying to understand. Completely, without performing any reaction until she'd finished gathering the information. Wait. At the tomb standing on either side of her father's chair, at Gary Sutton, standing 3 feet away with his arms at his sides and his decision legible in every part of his posture, at the guests in the lobby who weren't quite looking, at the woman at the concierge desk whose hands were flat and still. She took all of it in, and then she looked at her father and then back at Gary. Her voice was clear, not loud, but the lobby had gotten very quiet. And 8-year-olds who take their words seriously, a way of filling quiet spaces without trying. Daddy, a beat, while she continued looking at Gary. Why does that man look at you like you don't live here? Not belong, live here. The difference was small. The difference was everything. The man at the bar didn't touch his drink. Della's hands, flat on the concierge desk surface, went still in a different way. Not the stillness of covering something. The stillness of someone who has just heard something land and is still feeling where it hit. One of the security guards, the older one, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the face of a man who had seen enough versions of this situation to have stopped finding them simple, shifted his weight in a way that had nothing to do with his job. Gary didn't respond to Dara. He looked at Calvin instead, which was its own response. Dara tracked this. She was 8 years old, not naive. She looked back at her father with the expression of a child waiting for the person she trusted most to explain why the world wasn't adding up the way it was supposed to. Calvin looked at his daughter. He kept his voice the way he kept it when he needed her to understand that whatever was wrong was not her fault and not her responsibility to carry. You didn't do anything wrong, Dara, not one single thing. He held her gaze until she gave a small nod. The nod of a child who was accepting this for now and reserving the right to return to the question later. Then Calvin looked at Gary and reached into the pocket of his hoodie for his phone. The call lasted less than a minute. 4 sentences. 10 seconds of listening. He put the phone back in his pocket, rested his hand on Dara's shoulder. Daddy, quiet, just between them. Do we have to go? He looked at her face, at the question in it. At Scout held against her chest with both arms. At the expression of a child who was working very hard to find the part of this that made sense and was waiting for her father to hand it to her. Not tonight, Calvin said. We're not going anywhere tonight. Gary heard it. Took 1 step forward. Sir, I am telling you for the last. The elevator. Chime small sound. The Alterton's elevators nose made this sound dozens of times every evening, and no one ever particularly noticed it. Every person in the lobby noticed this one. The doors opened. Calvin Reeves, founder and sole owner of Reeves Hospitality Group, sat in the lobby of his flagship hotel with his daughter and her bear, and waited for what was coming next, because he had seen everything he'd come to see. He was done watching. Howard Finch stepped out of the elevator. 62 years old, silver-haired. Dark suit that he'd had enough time to button, but not to fully press flat before coming downstairs. He'd been in the Alderton for 2 days, running the property's quarterly operational review, which was why he was in the building at this hour, and why Calvin's forced sentence call had reached him in under 90 seconds, and why he was crossing the lobby right now with the controlled pace of a man who understood the exact weight of what he was walking into. He didn't look at Brett behind the desk, didn't look at Gary Sutton, didn't look at the 2 security guards still positioned on either side of Calvin's chair. He looked at Calvin. Calvin held up one hand. Stop. Howard stopped. 6 feet away. He'd worked alongside Calvin for 10 years, and he understood that gesture, the way understood a language you'd been speaking long enough that the translation happens somewhere below thought. Not yet. Calvin looked back at Gary. Gary was recalculating. You could see it moving through him. The small adjustments in his face as a man in a dark suit stepped off the elevator at this hour and crossed the lobby directly to the situation without so much as glancing at Gary's authority. He didn't know who Howard was. Not yet. But something about the quality of Howard's arrival, the directness of it, the complete absence of any deference to Gary's position in the room, had told him that the situation had changed shape in a way he hadn't anticipated. Finish what you started, Calvin said. Gary's eyes came back to him. You called security. They're here. You said you weren't asking me to leave. Calvin's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. So finish it. The lobby was quiet enough that the jazz from the had become the loudest sound in it. Low and unhurried, that slow, comfortable drift of a Friday night, oblivious to everything happening 30 feet away. Gary looked at Howard. Howard looked back at him with the expression of a man who had not come downstairs to help Gary Sutton navigate this. Gary looked at the security guard on Calvin's left. The guard was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the weathered face of someone who'd been in enough situations to have stopped being surprised by any of them. He was looking at a point on the floor between himself and Gary and showed no sign of moving in any particular direction. Gary looked at the other guard. Same stillness. He straightened his jacket. The automatic gesture of a man reaching for whatever intact surface he had left it. This has escalated beyond what I can resolve at the desk level. I'll need to involve. You involved yourself, Calvin said, when you walked out here and stood next to your clerk instead of asking him one question about what happened. The sentence stopped Gary's sentence. Calvin stood. He did it slowly, with Dara's comfort and stability factored into every movement the way it always was. She had stayed close at his side through all of it. Scout tucked under one arm, watching what was happening with the focused attention of a child who had decided this was something worth understanding fully. He stood to his full height, looked at Gary Sutton across the lobby floor of the building he'd built. No heat in it, no theater. Just the look of a man who had gathered everything he needed to understand the situation and had arrived at what he was going to do about it. Okay, Calvin said. Then he looked at Howard and nodded. Howard crossed the remaining distance. He stopped beside Calvin, facing the desk, facing Gary, facing Brett, who had not moved in 5 minutes, and had gone the color of the mahogany counter he was standing behind. When Howard spoke, his voice was even, the specific evenness that was quieter than anger and landed harder than volume. This is Calvin Reeves. He is the founder and sole owner of Reeves Hospitality Group. He owns this hotel. He owns the furniture you're standing next to, the uniforms you're wearing, and the contracts that determine whether you're employed here tomorrow. He let it sit for exactly one breath. I want everyone in this room to have a clear understanding of what happened here tonight. The lobby absorbed this, not with drama. Real revelation didn't work the way it did in films. It worked the way a pressure change worked, gradual and then total. The way air left a space. Brett's hands were flat on the counter in front of him. His face had the quality of someone who had just understood, without any remaining ambiguity, the full size of the thing they had done. Gerst was standing in the center of the lobby floor, with the look of a man whose entire map of the situation has been redrawn from underneath him, who is still standing in the old corded courts, trying to find where solid ground is. Dara looked at Howard, then at her father, then back at Howard with the quiet measuring attention of someone taking stock of a new piece of information. "Daddy, quiet. You know this man?" Calvin put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "Yeah, baby. I know this man." The lobby held. Nobody moved. Wait for a moment. The jazz, the warm light, the marble floor, the lobby of the Alderton, which Calvin had built, so that every person who entered it felt immediately expected, being something very far from what he'd built it to be. He looked at each face in the room. Brett behind the counter, with his hands flat on the wood. Gary in the middle of the floor. The security guard who had stepped back half a step without being instructed to. Della at the concierge desk with her hands flat and her eyes focused on a point in front of her, present for all of it, processing all of it, unable to do anything with any of it from where she stood. The man at the bar who still hadn't touched his drink. The other guests who had stopped performing, disinterest. Calvin looked at all of it. He was not thinking about what he wanted to say. He was thinking about what this moment required. Not for his own satisfaction, not for the performance of a justified response, but for the room, for his daughter, who was 8 years old and standing beside him, and was going to carry this night with her for the rest of her life, and whose understanding of it would be shaped in large part by how her father moved through it. Gary found his voice first. It took something. Calvin acknowledged that even in the moment, "Mr. Reeves, careful." The voice of a man trying to reconstruct a position that no longer existed from materials that were no longer structurally sound. To explain, we had no way of knowing the circumstances, the situation as it presented itself to my staff. He stopped. The sentence couldn't close. Something in him kept shutting it down before it reached a conclusion. He started again. My staff followed established protocols for, stopped again. The sentences launched and aborted, because every direction he aimed them ran into the same wall. There was no version of this explanation that changed what had happened. And somewhere inside Gary Sutton, underneath everything he was still performing, the part of him that had once been a kind of person kept refusing to let the dishonest sentence reach its end. Calvin let him exhaust it. When the words stopped coming, he spoke. "You're right," Calvin said. "You didn't know who I was." That's shoulders moved fractionally, the beginning of something that might have been relief. That's the whole point. The movement stopped. Calvin's voice stayed even, unhurried. The words came out the way things came out when they'd been sitting in a person long enough to know their exact shape. Everything you did tonight, the refusal. The story about an after 11 policy that doesn't exist. Calling security. Deciding to push this as far as it would go. You did all of it because you looked at me when I walked through that door and made a decision before I opened my mouth. Before I'd done a single thing to earn that response. You looked at what I was wearing and decided what I was worth. He paused. And you did it in front of my daughter. Gary opened his mouth. Calvin continued without pause. My father worked the night security shift in a hotel like this one for 22 years. He was an architectural engineer by training. He spent 3 years after graduation applying for 14 positions and being told in various ways that the answer was no. So he took what was offered. He was excellent at every part of it. And he came home every night carrying something that had no name, that he never talked about, but that I don't understood even as a kid. The specific weight of a man who has spent 8 hours being invisible on purpose because the job required it. He let it sit. I built this company because I believed you could do it differently. That the person at your desk deserves to be seen before they proved anything. Not after you decided they looked like the right kind of guest. Before, without conditions, every single time. He looked directly at Gary. You didn't fail a guest tonight. You failed everyone who has ever walked through a door like this one and been made to feel like the question of whether they belonged was still open. And you didn't do it by accident. You built a system that made it reliable. That last sentence was the one that changed something in Gary's face. He'd been in Sankey's for personal accusation. For you did this wrong, you are the problem. Here is what you should be ashamed of. He could have defended against that. He'd built walls before, and he knew how to stand behind them. But Calvin hadn't aimed at Gary's choices. He'd aimed at what Gary had constructed, at the culture, at the accumulated, unwritten, unremarkable signals that a 27-year-old desk clerk had absorbed over weeks or months and acted on reflexively without ever being given a document that said, "Treat these kinds of people this way." Brett's glanced at the camera before deciding how to respond to Calvin. That was the evidence. That wasn't instinct. That was a trained behavior, and trained behaviors came from somewhere. And somewhere in this case, was Gary Sutton. Gary knew this. You could see that he knew it in the way the accusation landed. Not with the shock of something untrue, with the specific heaviness of something you'd been aware of for a while and had been choosing to examine too closely. Calvin reached into his hoodie pocket. He took out a cap, faded navy, the brim soft and worn smooth from decades of handling. Earl Reeves had worn this cap every shift for 22 years. Not as part of the uniform was the hotel's, but his own. The one piece of hoodie he'd been before the Hargrove that he carried into the Hargrove every night and brought back out every morning. A small private refusal to let the job be the whole story of who he was. Calvin had found it at the bottom of a box of his Fosse things, all folded inside a work shirt, when he'd finally gotten around to clearing out the storage unit 8 months after Earl died. She'd sat on the floor of that unit in Charlotte for a long time before he could put it back in the box. He'd kept it in a drawer in his home office for 12 years. He'd started carrying it on property visits 2 months ago, not as a simple, not as something he showed anyone, just because it felt right to have it near. Because some things you carried, not because they were heavy, but because putting them down cost more than keeping them. He set the cap on the counter of his own front desk, placed it there without ceremony. "My father wore this every night I went into that building," he said. "He was an architect who spent 22 years doing a job smaller than what he was built for, and he never once let that make him smaller than himself. Not once." He let the cap sit on the counter. Then he looked at Gary. "Gary, you're terminated effective tonight." Gary's face to something gray and interior, not the expression of a man surprised. The expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he recognized, who had known, on some level below the level of his daily performing, that this was where the road he'd chosen eventually led. He didn't argue. He straightened his jacket, the small automatic gesture of a man salvaging the one intact thing about the moment. Then he walked toward the back corridor without looking at anyone. The door opened, the door closed, the lobby released a breath. Calvin picked up his father's cap, folded it, put it back in his pocket. Then he turned to the front desk. Brett Okafor was standing behind the counter with the stillness of a man who had run out of ways to arrange himself in a room. His jaw was set. His eyes was swallowed someone working very hard to hold themselves together in a public space and not fully succeeding at the edges of it. He was 27 years old. He had taken this job because it was a good job on a city he was trying to build a life, and the rent had his monthly opinion about whether he kept it. He had been taught in ways that were explicit enough to question or argue with how to read the room. He had not questioned it. He had absorbed it and acted on it the way people acted on things that had been framed as professional skill and rather than moral choice. And then an 8-year-old had asked a question in a quiet lobby, and he had heard it and understood in the way you understood as things that came from children, because children hadn't yet learned to pad the truth for your comfort, exactly what he had been doing and what it had cost the person on the other side of it. Calvin walked to the counter, stopped in front of him, kept his voice even, not punishing, not unkind. "You made a call tonight, based on what someone's looked like. I need you to sit with that, not with what it costs you professionally, with what it costs the person standing on the other side of it." Brett's throat moved. "You're not losing your job tonight. Calvin said, but you're going through a full retraining program. Not skills or values. You're going to spend real time learning what this work actually is and who it's for. He looked at Dara, then back at Brett. And before this night is over, you're going to apologize to my daughter. Not because it's required by protocol, because she was actually here. Brett came around the side of the counter. The movement was not graceful. He hadn't planned it, and it showed in every step. He crouched down to Dara's level, which put him face to face with an 8-year-old holding a stuffed bear. And he spoke without the smoothness his training had bugged him for guest interactions. I'm sorry. His voice was rougher than he'd probably intended. What I did tonight was wrong. I knew it was wrong while I was doing it, and I did it anyway, and I'm sorry. Dara looked at him. She took her time. She was not a child who rushed the things that mattered. Okay, she said, but next time just look at the person, not the clothes. Something moved through the lobby. The sound a room made when it had been holding something at high tension for too long, and something honest finally gave it a way out. The release of a room full of people who had been waiting for something real. Howard turned away briefly, doing something careful with his mouth. The man at the bar exhaled a breath that had clearly been sitting in him for a while. Brett nodded at Dara, twice, neither one for show. Calvin straightened. He walked to the concierge station. Della Morse had been at that desk through all of it, with her hands flat on the surface and the expression of someone who was present for everything and processing everything, and had been unable to do anything with any of it from the fixed position she'd been given. Calvin stopped in front of her, kept his voice low. You sent a message to Howard tonight. 22 minutes before he came down. She looked up. He'd seen the timestamp when Howard showed him the phone during the 30 seconds before the elevator doors opened. You didn't do it because you knew who I was, Calvin said. You did it because something wrong was happening, and you found the one action available to you inside the structure you were working in. I wanted to do more, Della said. I almost came out from behind this desk. Twice, maybe 3 times. She paused. This place was structured. I wasn't certain I could. I know, Calvin said. That's a failure of leadership, not of character. He looked at her steadily. Starting Monday, you're moving into a supervisory role in guest services. I need people in positions where they can act on what they know is right, not just find the available workaround from a fixed desk. Della held his gaze. Something in her face settled into something decided and firm. I won't let you down, she said. I know you won't. That's why this conversation is this short. He turned back to face the room. The guests who remained were watching him openly now. No phones, no performance of disinterest. People who had been in a room where something real happened and were still sitting with the fact of having seen it. Calvin spoke without preamble. I've been building hotels for a long time. There is one standard I have never negotiated on and will not negotiate on now. Every person who walks through our doors gets treated with dignity. Not based on what they're wearing. Not based on what time it is or whether at the desk decides they look like the right kind of guest. Every person. Every time. Without exception. A pause. That is what this company is. If it's not something you can commit to, I would genuinely rather you find somewhere else to work. Not a threat. An honest statement of what we are and what we're not willing to stop being. The room held it, and then Dara pulled on Howard's hand. Daddy. The clear, unhurried voice of a child who has been patient through a very long evening and has arrived at her honest limit. Can we get our room now? I'm really tired. The lobby exhaled. Howard's mouth did the thing again. The man at the bar smiled for the first time in 40 minutes. Calvin looked down at his daughter, at her face with Scout in both arms and the completely sincere exhaustion of someone 8 years old, who had been awake long past her time and wanted nothing more complex than sleep. And the thing that had been sitting in his chest all evening, the specific weight of it, the accumulated load of the night, shifted it into something with more room. Yeah, baby, he said. We're getting our room. Brett processed the check-in himself. Quietly, carefully. When he handed the key cards to Calvin, he did it with both hands, which wasn't the hotel's standard protocol. Just what he did. Calvin took them without comment. He and Dara crossed the lobby to the elevator. She'd taken his hand somewhere in the last 20 minutes and hadn't let go. At the elevator, she looked back at the room, at Brett, back behind the desk, at Della, crossing toward the concierge station, at the warm light on the tile floor that Calvin had chosen himself 4 years ago, standing in an empty space with a contractor and a vision of what the room was supposed to feel like. "Daddy," she said, is it always going to be like that when we come to your hotels?" He thought about the reassuring version, the smoothed-over answers that let her go to sleep without carrying more than she needed to at 8 years old. He chose honesty instead. "Sometimes," he said. "That's why we check." Dara absorbed this with the completeness she brought to most things. "Okay," she said. The elevator opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. The lobby of the Aldertons settled back into itself. The jazz, the light, the marble floor. With one fewer person in it who believed the rules of hospitality applied differently to different kinds of people, which was exactly what Calvin had come to find out, and what he intended to spend the next 3 months making sure never happened in any building that carried his name. 3 months was enough time for a thing to take root or die. Calvin had learned this the way he learned most things that actually stuck. Not from instruction, but from the repeated experience of going back to a decision and finding out what had really grown there. Whether the thing he'd intended had taken hold in the soil of ordinary days, in the unremarkable Tuesday mornings and Friday afternoons, shift changes when no one was watching and no one was performing, or whether it had been the kind of thing that looked like itself in the moment of making and then quietly lost its shape once the moment was over. The decisions was almost never the hard part. The hard part was 3 months later. The ordinary Tuesday. The building doing what it did when it was on its own. Calvin came back to the Alderton on a Tuesday afternoon in January. He drove himself and parked in the structure 2 blocks east of the building rather than the covered entry. The morning had been cold in the way Atlanta mornings sometimes were in January, sharp and still and without sentiment. And he wore a jacket. He walked the 2 blocks with his hands in his pockets. And the particular internal quiet of a man who was moving toward something he wasn't certain about yet. On the sidewalk across from the Alderton, he stopped. He gave himself 60 seconds, the outside view, the stranger's view. Before the interior's familiarity adjusted his eyes into something that couldn't see clearly, what he saw was a building that looked tended. Not maintained for inspection, tended in the way that came from people who understood why the details mattered rather than people who were check-eye boxes, because the boxes would be checked on them. The entry was clean. The planters were in reasonable shape for January in Georgia. The front glass was clear. The lights were doing what he specified they should do. He crossed the street and pushed through the revolving door. Della Morse was on the floor, not behind the concierge desk, on the open floor between the entrance and the front desk, which she had restructured in her 4th week in the new role. She'd brought the idea to Howard at the end of her 3rd week. She wanted to reposition the first point of human phone contact, not behind a fixed station where guests had to find their way to her. On the floor, moving toward guests at the moment of arrival, before they'd had to navigate anything, before they'd needed to ask for anything. Howard had called Calvin. Calvin had said to try it. 30 days. Let the numbers say something, scene. At 30 days, Howard sent a single text. Guest experience scores up 9 points. We're keeping it. What the scores didn't capture, and what Calvin saw now, was what it looked like from the inside. A family was coming through the revolving door. 2 parents in their mid-30s, carrying the specific compound exhaustion of people who had been in a car together for the better part of a day. Not unpleasant, just the accumulated weight of confined proximity and too many miles. 2 kids behind them, a girl around 7, a boy who might have been 4, carrying a plastic dinosaur with the focused seriousness of someone transporting something that could not be replaced if lost. Della crossed to meet them before they'd covered half the distance to the front desk. She introduced herself by name, asked about the drive in a way that indicated she was actually interested in the answer, rather, because she followed up on what they said, rather than accepting the response as a formality and moving on. When she spoke to the children, she looked at them directly and addressed them by name once she'd learned it, getting down slightly to the level of the 4-year-old to ask about the dinosaur. His name was Gerald. He did not like loud noises. Della received this information with the same seriousness she would have given any relevant guest preference. She made a note on the tablet she carried. Gerald's noise sensitivity, room assignment away from the bar side of the building, heads up, zap to relish Steph if family was going to be near the lobby during any event that would raise ambient volume. Small things. The kind of small things that would never appear on a comment card or in a review, but that a 4-year-old would carry somewhere inside him as evidence of how places worked. Within 2 minutes of arrival, the mother's shoulders had come down. Within 4, the father was smiling at something Della had said. And the smile was not the polite social variety, but the kind that arrived because something had actually been funny. Within 6, the boy with Gerald had decided Della was a trustworthy person and was explaining, in the detailed, non-linear way of 4-year-olds with urgent information to convey, the full complexity of Gerald's relationship with ambient sound levels. Della was listening with attention and asking clarifying questions. Calvin watched this from the door and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not pride exactly, though. Pride was part of it. Something closer to recognition. The scene of seeing a place become what you always meant it to be, which was genuinely from seeing it look like what you meant it to be. One was performance. The other was truth. You could tell the difference if you knew how to look. He found a chair in the corner of the lobby and sat. Not to conduct observation. He'd already seen what he'd come to see. He sat because the room was warm and right, and he had time before his 2 o'clock call, and he wants to spend it here, in this lobby, in the building that had cost him more of himself than any other property in the portfolio. Not the money. Money was a problem with solutions, or with alternative routes around it, and Calvin had always been able to find a route. The cost he was thinking about was different. It was the cost of believing in a thing long enough that it became true. Believing it past the years, when the industry pushed back in the ways. Industries pushed back on people who built things from the wrong starting point. Past the moments when it would have been easier to build something smaller and less insistent on past just exactly what it claimed to be. Thought about the call he'd had with Della in her 3rd week. She'd been developing the training curriculum and had called to ask whether she could use the story of Earl Reeves as the opening case. Not the Hargrove specifically. The shape of it. An architectural engineer who spent 22 years nights-on-night security shift. What that cost him. What it cost the field he'd trained for, which lost what he could have contributed. What it cost every guest who walked past him without registry's presence and was thereby deprived of an interaction with some good buildings in a way most people never would. Calvin had sat with the phone and thought about it. Yes, he'd said. Use it. Is there anything you'd want me to include that I might not know? He'd thought about the kitchen table, 3 in the morning. The specific quality of his father's silence in those minutes, and the discipline it represented. He was never bitter, Calvin said. That's the thing people might assume, and I'd want them to understand it differently. He got tired in a way that had nowhere to go except home. But he never let follow him through the door. Della had been quiet for a moment. That's the whole curriculum, she'd said. Calvin had thought about that for days afterward. She'd titled it The First 60 Seconds. The premise was straightforward, and had come, she'd told him, from watching what happened at the Alderton in the weeks after October. From watching what Delft did differently, now that she was on the floor instead of behind the desk. From measuring against the baseline of what had been happening before, what changed when the first 60 seconds of a guest sex experience were shaped by a human being moving toward them, rather than waiting to be found. The data was one part of it. The other part was harder to measure and more important. The first 60 seconds after a person walked through a door told them something. Not consciously, not in a way they could articulate afterward in a survey, but somewhere in them, in the place where people kept their assessment of whether a space was safe and whether they mattered in it, the first 60 seconds left a mark. And that mark shaped everything that came after it. How relaxed they were at dinner, how honestly they reported a problem, whether they told people about the place or just let the experience go unremarked. You earned those 60 seconds or you didn't. And the earning happened before a word was spoken. It happened in whether the person who first saw you moved towards you or waited. In whether their face said you are expected or said you may or may not be the right kind of person. We're still assessing. Howard had read the full curriculum document and called Calvin. "This is what we should have built from the start," he said. "Yes," Calvin agreed. "It is." "All properties?" "All properties." Della goes to each location personally for the first session, not a video call, in person. She needs to be in the room. She'll be traveling constantly. Ask her if she's willing. Della had not hesitated. The Nashville property had gone through the first 60 seconds 6 weeks after the night at the Alderton. Calvin had acquired it 5 weeks after that night. A mid-range hotel near the convention center. 3 years underperforming under management that had been focused on occupancy numbers at the expense of almost everything else. Good bones, good location. Needed rebuilding from the interior out. He'd walked it twice before the papers were signed.
What's the suit?
Once in the gray hoodie and dark jeans with the scuffed left sneaker. The experiences had been meaningfully different. Not dramatically. Not in any way a person who wasn't paying careful attention would have registered. But Calvin was paying careful attention, and what he'd seen in the hoodie were the small habitual recalibrations. The way the desk clerk's expression arrived at a slightly different pace when he looked at Calvin the second time. The way the question about room availability was answered with a fractional additional uncertainty. As if the answer were settled, as if the certainty that had been available to the man in the suit acquired slightly more evidence before it could be extended to this version of the same person in different clothes. 3 staff members flagged. Prop required. Della in Nashville 4 weeks later, with the curriculum and the authority to rebuild them from the ground up. She'd spent 3 days on site, running sessions, following up individually with the staff members Calvin had flagged, assessing what the cushions had been, what it was going to need to be instead. The 30-day numbers from Nashville had come in last week. Calvin had read them twice. Then he'd called Della and said 3 words. "Good work. Keep going." At the front desk, Brett was running a clean check-in. The guest was a man in his early 50s, the compact efficiency of a frequent business traveler. And Brett was matching his without overdoing it. Present, competent, not performing warmth he didn't have, but also not withholding what he did have. He made eye contact the way people made eye contact when it was a genuine habit rather than a trained technique. Calvin had come back to the Alderton twice in the 3 since October. Both times in the hoodie. Both times without announcement. First visit 6 weeks after. Brett handling a billing issue for a couple like told their 70s with patience that wasn't performed, the genuine variety, the kind that required actually caring about the outcome, rather than just the appearance of professionalism. Della not yet on the floor in the new role, but the concierge station already functioning differently, with an attentiveness that extended beyond the immediate vicinity. Second visit, 10 weeks after. The full structuring in place, Della on the floor, Brett leading a smooth shift change that he'd clearly done a number of times now, transferring information to the incoming clerk with the kind of thoroughness that came from having internalized why the information mattered. Not perfection. Perfection was not the standard. Perfection was not achievable, and the pursuit of it was its own kind of distortion. What Talbot had seen on both visits was effort that came from a real place. From people who were doing the work because they understood what it was for, rather than because someone was going to check. That was what the building was now. Howard came through the back corridor door at 155, saw Calvin in the corner, and changed direction. He dropped into the chair beside him with the ease of someone who had long ago stopped being formal about the informalities. They sat without talking for a moment, watching the lobby. A couple arrived, and Della was there. Two business travelers arriving separately, within 90 seconds of each other, both absorbed into the flow, without friction or waiting. An older man coming in alone with too much luggage, and the slight disoriented looks of someone who hadn't slept well on their flight, Della appearing at his elbow before he'd gotten his bearings, redistributing the problem, without making it feel like a rescue. "How does it look to you?" Howard said. "Like what I built it to be," Calvin said. "That's the first time I've been able to say that without qualifications." Howard nodded slowly. He moved the bread at the desks, watched the smoothness of it, the ease that came from having done something enough times to stop thinking about the mechanics and start thinking about the person. "I keep thinking about that couple," Howard said, "from that night. The walk-ins." Calvin waited. "They have no idea. They came in, got a room, had whatever experience they had, and left. They'll probably come back some months, and they'll never know that the night they happened to was the night. Everything in this building changed." Howard considered it. "They were just in the lobby. That's the point," Calvin said. "A guest shouldn't need to know the building changed. They should just feel that it's right. If they're noticing the change, we've made the change about us rather than about them." Howard was quiet. Then, "Earl would have liked this place." Calvin looked at the lobby. The light on the tile his father had never walked across as anything other than someone else's employee, he said. He would have. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who had known each other long enough not to fill it unnecessarily. Then Howard stood. 2 o'clock, go ahead, I'll dial in from here." Howard left. Calvin stayed. He watched the lobby work. Watch it be what it was on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when nobody was performing for anyone. A family coming through with tired kids and Della there to meet them. A solo traveler navigating the check-in process with Brett's help, the transaction moving efficiently toward its conclusion without losing the quality of it being an interaction between two actual people. A guest coming out of the elevator and pausing at the lobby level, looking slightly uncertain, and one of the lobby staff crossing to them before they'd had to ask anyone for anything. The small, continuous work of a place that had decided what it was. After the 2 o'clock call ended, Della came to find him. She crossed the lobby with the ease of someone who had stopped being intimidated by the room she was in. She stopped in front of his chair without any particular ceremony. "Almost 3 hours," she said. "I know. How does it look?" He considered the question seriously, the way she'd asked it seriously. "It looks honest," he said. "Not because it's running without problems. Because the problems get handled by people who care about the outcome. That's the thing you can't train directly. You can only create the conditions for it." Della nodded. The nod of someone allowing themselves to register that something hard has worked. "The Nashville numbers," she said. "I saw them. The second cohort starts next month. The first cohort supervisors are already running modified versions with their own teams." She paused. "The Earl Reeves section lands differently than anything else in the curriculum, every time. What do you think it is?" She thought about it without hurrying. "It's specific," she said. "It's not a principle. It's not a value statement. It's a person. A person who had a real experience, and the experience had a real cost." She looked at the lobby. People can feel the difference between something true and something constructed to sound meaningful. The Earl Reeves section is true, and they know it. Calvin sat with that. "I almost didn't send that message," Della said, "that night." He looked at her. "I had the phone out twice and put it back down. The second time I almost called Howard directly, but I didn't know if that was. I wasn't sure it was my place. What made you send it the third time? She was quiet for a moment, working back to it honestly. Your daughter's question, she said. When she asked why that man was looking at you like you didn't live there. She paused, the way she said it. Like the answer was obvious. Like of course you lived there. Like of course everyone lived there. That was just the baseline anyone should start from. A beat. I thought if an 8-year-old can see that clearly, I don't have an excuse for putting the phone down again. Calvin held that. Della? She looked at him. You did the right thing that night before you knew who I was. Before there was any professional reason to do it. Before there was any guarantee it would matter. She didn't deflect it. She let it land. Someone had to, she said. Yes, Calvin said, but it was you. She looked at him for a moment. Then, go home, Mr. Reeves. Your daughter has somewhere to be. He stood. He passed the front desk on the way to the door. Brett looked up, made eye contact the way he'd learned to, and gave a small nod. Calvin nodded back. Private, just between them. The nod that didn't need translation between people who knew what it meant. He pushed through the revolving door. The January air came in clean and cold. He walked the 2 blocks to the parking structure with his hands in his jacket pockets, taking the slight longer route around the block because he wanted the air and the movement and the time between the hotel and the rest of the afternoon. In the car, he sat before starting the engine. He reached to the passenger seat. Earl Reeves's cap was there. He'd start bringing it on property visits in November, not as a symbol, not as something he showed people or spoke about to anyone, just because having it near felt like the honest thing to do when he was walking into a building he'd built in his father's name. Doing the thing his father had never been given the chance to do. He held it for a moment, the soft, worn brim, the fabric that had moved past color into texture, past object into the feel of a specific set of years. Earl had carried this into the Hargrove every night and brought it back out every morning. Had worn it to and from work, but not on duty, where the uniform was the uniform and was someone else's. This Kappa's was his own, a small daily act of not letting the job determine the whole shape of who he was. A private insistence on continuity with the person he'd been before the hotel and would be again when he walked back out its door. Calvin had found it at the bottom of a box in a storage unit in Charlotte. He'd sat on the floor of that unit for a long time. He'd kept it for 12 years before he understood what to do with it. He set it soft seat. Started the car. He thought about Dara. She was at school right now, probably in the last class of the afternoon, with the particular folk energy she brought to the last stretch of a school day. She had a spelling test on Friday, which she'd told him about 3 times, which meant she was genuinely worried about it, which meant she'd studied it until worry became familiarity. He'd quiz her after dinner, make it into the game his father used to make things into, because Earl had understood that a thing you were dreading was easier to approach when someone you trusted made it into something you did together. He drove. He thought about Gerald the dinosaur and the way the 4-year-old had explained Gerald's noise preferences, Della, with the urgent seriousness of some communicating something critical, and the way Della had listened and made her note and adjusted the room assignment and flagged the staff. And how none of this would ever appear in any metric. Gerald's well-being was not a key performance indicator, but that family would remember this stay. The boy would carry something from it, not as a conscious memory, not as something he could retrieve and examine, but as da-da about how the world worked. In the place where children kept the evidence of things, he would have this, that some places noticed you, that some places paid attention to what mattered to you, before you had to explain why it mattered. That being seen was not a reward for being the right kind of person. It was just what happened when you walked in, and maybe in 30 years he would be building something. A company, a school, a neighborhood, a room where decisions got made, and somewhere in the foundation of whatever he built without being able to trace it back to Gerald and the hotel in Atlanta, he would insist on a particular standard. The one where you noticed people. The one where attention was the baseline. The one where you didn't wait for someone to prove they deserved it. That was how it moved through time. Not through policy documents filed in binders. Not through the values statements that hung in break rooms and were read once during orientation and never again. Through the small accumulated evidence gathered by children in unremarkable moments, in hotel lobbies and waiting rooms and ordinary places, that being seen was normal, that it was expected, that anyone walking through any door had every right to expect it. Calvin turned onto the highway. Atlanta moved around him. The January light going gold at the low angles of late afternoon, thin and clear without the sentimentality that other seasons put into the light. He thought about what he'd said to Dara in the elevator in October. Sometimes. That's why we check. She'd taken it the way she took most hard truths, absorbed it completely without needing it softened or explained into something easier to carry. Filed it in whatever internal place she kept things she was still working out. And moved forward. That was his daughter. 8 years old and already in possession of something he'd spent decades trying to fully develop. The ability to receive something difficult without needing it padded. To hold it as it actually was. To keep moving. He'd quiz her on the spelling words, and she would resist for approximately 4 minutes, and then give in, because she actually wanted to know she had them right, and he was the person she trusted to tell her the truth about that. They would eat dinner, and she would ask us about something she'd been thinking about at school. One of the questions she carried 4 days before she found the right moment to bring it out. He would answer honestly, or tell her honestly that he didn't know. And she would consider his answer with the same seriousness she brought to everything. And then she would either accept it or tell him she thought he'd be wrong, which she had been doing since she was 6, and which she was often right about. He drove. The highway opened out in front of him, long and clear and heading home. 11 blocks behind him, the Alderton held its Tuesday afternoon. Della on the floor, Brett at the desk. Gerald settled in a room on the quiet side of the building with his family, the lobby doing what it did when no one was watching it do it. The building his father never walked through as anything other than someone else's employee. The building Calvin made from the thing Earl Reeves had shown him at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning by not saying anything about it at all. That you could carry what the world handed you and still come home and mean your questions. That the people who deserved to be seen were not the people who had first proven something to you. That the person who walked through your door deserved the same 60 seconds of honest attention as anyone else. You decided anything about them, but before the question of whether they belonged had a chance to become a question. The highway, the city behind him, the afternoon ahead. Calvin drove home, to the spelling words, to his daughter, to the ordinary Tuesday of the life he was building alongside the company he'd built. And the lobby of the Alderton, 11 blocks back, held what it had always been meant to hold, every person, every time, without exception. Because some things, if you build them right and tend them honestly, hold. Not because they're perfect, because the people inside them have decided they will. And that decision, made fresh every single day by people who understood what it was for, was the only thing that had ever made anything worth building last.